She was called ugly in front of the entire glittering room, but the Duke, the scarred, formidable Duke of Haven, he heard every vicious word and claimed her as his bride that very night. Why? What does he see in the woman society has dismissed? Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden beauty and unexpected devotion, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of resilience, romance, and second chances. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. The grey afternoon light that filtered through the narrow window of Lydia Cromwell's chamber was harsh and unforgiving, as though even the sun understood it had a duty to expose rather than flatter. Lydia stood before her dressing table, her posture rigid, her fingers working methodically through the severe bun she wore like armor. The room around her was neither warm nor welcoming, functional, cold, deliberately stripped of softness. She'd learned long ago that softness invited cruelty. Her morning ritual was precise, the darkest dress from her wardrobe, charcoal today, though black would have served just as well, never a color that might draw the eye. Hair pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache, each strand disciplined into submission. No adornment, no ribbon, no compromise. If they would call her ugly, she would give them exactly what they expected. Nothing to question, nothing to mock beyond what they'd already decided. The mirror before her was large and gilt-edged, a cruel inheritance from her late father's first wife, Victoria's mother. A mirror meant for beauty to admire itself, to turn and preen, and find endless delight in its own reflection. Lydia met her own gaze in it now, as she did each morning, conducting the same ruthless inventory. 24 years old, the thought arrived with neither pride nor despair, simply a marker of time passing in a life that had long ago stopped expecting brightness. Pale skin that had never flushed prettily like Victoria's, eyes too large, too dark, too intense. They unnerved people, she'd been told, made her look as though she were always judging, always seeing too much. A mouth too serious, a jaw too strong, cheekbones that cast shadows rather than caught light. Features that might have been called striking in a different arrangement, on a different woman, in a different life, but arranged as they were, on her face, in this house, they added up to one word, ugly, the word Victoria had wielded since they were children, when Lydia's father had remarried and brought his serious, quiet daughter into a house that had no use for either quality. The word that had hardened around Lydia like a shell, protective and imprisoning all at once. She'd stopped fighting it years ago. Instead, she'd learned to inhabit it, to make it her fortress. If she was ugly, then she would be impeccably ugly, so severe, so austere, that no one could claim she was trying and failing. She would simply be what they'd named her, and find her worth elsewhere, in books, in silence, in the small dignity of expecting nothing. The knock at her door came sharply, without courtesy. "Lydia," Victoria's voice, bright and cutting as always. "You're not still dressing, are you? We leave for Lord Ashworth's dinner in an hour, and I won't have you making us late with your fussing." Fussing, as though Lydia ever fussed, as though this severe uniform she wore required anything more than grim efficiency. "I'm ready," Lydia called back, her voice even. "Well, do try not to stand in the corner looking like a spectre all evening," Victoria continued through the door, her tone light, almost playful, the particular cruelty of someone who knew their barbs would land. "Lord Ashworth has invited half of London. There will be eligible men there, Lydia. I know you've given up, but do try to pretend you haven't, for Papa's memory, if nothing else." Footsteps retreated down the hallway, accompanied by Victoria's bright laughter and the rustle of what was undoubtedly a beautiful gown. Lydia turned back to the mirror. Tonight there would be the dinner, Lord Ashworth's annual gathering, where Victoria would shine like a jewel carefully set, and Lydia would be paraded as the necessary shadow, the plain stepsister who made beauty look all the more luminous by comparison. She'd learned to endure these nights. She'd learned to be silent, invisible, still, to stand near the windows or the bookshelves where she might go unnoticed, to smile politely when spoken to and fade when the conversation moved on, to be exactly what they expected, forgettable. She fastened the last button at her collar, high and restricting. What Lydia had not learned, could not have anticipated, was that tonight someone would finally see past the armor. and that seeing would change everything. The carriage ride to Lord Ashworth's estate was exactly as Lydia had anticipated. Victoria chattering brightly about who might be in attendance, her stepmother offering periodic hums of approval, and Lydia pressed against the far corner of the seat, her hands folded precisely in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing darkness beyond the window. "The Duke of Haven is expected," Victoria said, her voice lifting with barely concealed excitement. "Can you imagine? They say he never attends these things, but Lord Ashworth must have some particular influence. Though I suppose it's morbid curiosity on my part. I've heard he's absolutely disfigured. Some riding accident years ago. Half his face, they say, though he keeps to the shadows." "Victoria," her mother chided gently, though her tone held more amusement than reproach. "Well, it's what everyone says. And that he's impossibly cold. Turned away 3 perfectly acceptable matches last season without even the courtesy of an explanation." Victoria smoothed her rose silk gown, the colour luminous even in the dim carriage light. "I do wonder what sort of woman could ever satisfy such a man. Someone extraordinary, I should think." Her gaze slid to Lydia then, just briefly, and the smile that touched her lips was delicate and devastating. Then again, perhaps he'll appreciate honesty. A man with his situation surely understands that beauty isn't everything. The pause before situation was deliberate, surgical. "Don't you think, Lydia? You've always been so practical about such things." Lydia met her stepsister's eyes with the calm she'd practiced for years. "I think a man of the Duke's position likely values substance over ornament." "How wise you are." Victoria's smile widened. "That's precisely the sort of thing you should say tonight if anyone speaks to you. Wise and serious. It suits you." The words landed exactly where Victoria intended them, not as compliment, but as confirmation. Wise and serious were what one called women who could not be called beautiful. Lydia had heard the translation 1,000 times. The carriage turned up the long drive to Ashworth House, and Lydia watched the lights of the great manor grow closer. Inside, there would be hundreds of candles, glittering chandeliers, women in jewel-toned gowns, and men in crisp evening dress. There would be music and laughter, and the constant hum of society evaluating, judging, measuring worth. And there would be Lydia, in her charcoal gown with its high collar and long sleeves, her hair pulled back without mercy, standing near the bookshelves or the wallpaper where the light didn't quite reach. Her armor was in place. It always was. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as the carriage rolled to a stop and a footman opened the door, was that tonight her armor would finally fail her. Not because it would crack, but because someone would see straight through it. Gideon Talbot, 8th Duke of Haven, arrived at Ashworth House precisely on time, which was to say unfashionably early by society's standards, but exactly when the invitation had specified. He had little patience for the games others played with punctuality, just as he had little patience for most of the rituals that governed the world he inhabited. The footman who took his coat kept his eyes carefully averted from the left side of Gideon's face, which told Gideon everything he needed to know. The scar was visible tonight despite his careful positioning in the carriage. The jagged line that ran from temple to jaw, a souvenir from a riding accident 5 years prior, though accident implied misfortune rather than the deliberate sabotage it had been. He'd survived. The horse hadn't, and the woman he'd been foolish enough to consider marrying had taken one look at his ravaged face in the surgeon's room and fled. Not immediately, of course. Lady Catherine Morland had been far too well-bred for such obvious cruelty. She'd waited 3 days, sent a carefully worded letter expressing her deepest sympathies and regrets, and married a viscount within the month. A viscount with an unblemished face and half Gideon's income. The title she'd wanted, the man she could not bear to look at. Gideon had learned his lesson with the thoroughness he applied to everything. Sentiment was a liability, vulnerability was weakness, and marriage, when he eventually succumbed to the necessity of producing an heir, would be a transaction. Nothing more. He entered the drawing room and positioned himself near the far wall where the candlelight was dimmest, a habit so ingrained he no longer thought about it. From here he could observe without being observed, catalogue without being catalogued. Lord Ashworth approached almost immediately, effusive in his greeting, and Gideon endured the pleasantries with the bare minimum of courtesy required by his rank. "So glad you could attend, Your Grace. I know these gatherings aren't quite your preference, but I do hope you'll find the company stimulating." Ashworth's eyes gleamed with the particular enthusiasm of a man who fancied himself a matchmaker. "Several unmarried ladies present tonight, all quite suitable." Suitable, the word everyone used when they meant compliant, decorative, willing to overlook disfigurement for a duchess's coronet. "I'm sure they are," Gideon said, his tone flat enough to discourage further commentary. Ashworth, undeterred, gestured toward the growing crowd. "Do circulate, Your Grace. One never knows what one might find." Gideon watched his host retreat, then turned his attention to the room with the clinical detachment he'd perfected. Young ladies in pastels clustered near the musicians. Matrons positioned strategically near the refreshments. Men discussing politics and hunting near the card tables. The usual choreography of society performing for itself. His gaze moved across faces with no particular interest until it snagged on a figure standing alone near the window. A woman in charcoal grey, severe and still as a statue, her posture so rigidly controlled it looked painful. And behind her, a blonde in rose silk, laughing brightly at something a gentleman had said while glancing back at the woman in grey with an expression Gideon recognized instantly: cruelty, dressed as charm. He'd seen that look before, worn it on Catherine's face the last time she'd looked at him. His attention sharpened, and for the first time that evening, Gideon felt something other than cold obligation. Curiosity. Dinner was announced, and the crowd began its migration toward the dining room in a rustle of silk and low conversation. Lydia had positioned herself to slip in near the end, to take whatever seat remained unclaimed at the far reaches of the table, when Victoria's voice rang out with crystalline clarity. "Oh, Your Grace, what an honor!" Victoria had somehow maneuvered herself directly into the Duke of Haven's path, her curtsy perfect, her smile radiant. "I'm Miss Victoria Cromwell. I do hope you're enjoying the evening." Lydia froze. She could see the Duke now, tall and imposing in severe black, his face half-shadowed, but his bearing unmistakable. Power in human form, controlled and remote. "Miss Cromwell," he acknowledged, his tone polite but cold. Victoria wasn't deterred. She never was. "You must allow me to introduce my stepsister. She's just there, Lydia. Do come here. Don't lurk so." Every instinct screamed at Lydia to refuse, to fade into the wallpaper as she'd done 100 times before. But Victoria's voice had carried, and now eyes were turning, curious and amused. To refuse would create a scene. To comply would invite humiliation. She chose humiliation. It was familiar, at least. Lydia stepped forward, her movements precise, her face carefully blank. She could feel the Duke's gaze on her, assessing, and she braced herself for the usual flicker of dismissal she saw in most men's eyes. "Your Grace," she murmured, curtsying with exact propriety. "Lady Lydia," he said, and something in his voice made her glance up despite herself. His eyes were dark, intense, and fixed on her with an attention that felt almost physical. Victoria's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Oh, not Lady, Your Grace, just Miss. My stepsister has never been one for society's finer attentions." She tilted her head with practiced sympathy. "Lydia prefers her books to ballrooms, don't you, dear? She's really quite unsuited to occasions like this. Unfit for public notice, one might say." The pause was delicate, deliberate, quite ugly, actually. The words dropped into the conversation like stones into still water. Several people nearby had been listening, and Lydia heard the sharp intake of breath, the barely suppressed gasps. Not shock at the cruelty, society had witnessed far worse, but shock that it had been spoken so plainly, so publicly, in front of a duke. Lydia felt the familiar shell close around her. This was her role, silent, dignified, absorbing the blow without reaction. She began to step back, to retreat, as she always did. But then the Duke moved. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his focus entirely on Lydia, with an intensity that made the crowded room feel suddenly smaller. Up close, she could see the scar that ran down the left side of his face, stark and unapologetic. And she could see his eyes, not cold now, but burning with something she couldn't name. "Ugly," he repeated, the word quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. His gaze held hers. "That is the word you used, Miss Cromwell," Victoria faltered. Your Grace, I only meant—" "I heard what you meant." He didn't look at Victoria. He looked only at Lydia, and when he spoke again, His voice was clear enough for half the room to hear. "Miss Lydia Cromwell, I find myself in need of a companion for dinner. Would you do me the honor?" Lydia stared at him, unable to form words. His expression didn't soften, but something in his eyes did. "And perhaps," he added, his voice dropping just slightly, "the greater honor of allowing me to call on you tomorrow. I find I have a proposal to make." The remainder of the dinner passed in a blur of whispered speculation and sideways glances. Lydia sat beside the Duke at the table's center, a position of prominence she'd never occupied in her life, and managed to consume perhaps 3 bites of food while acutely aware of every eye upon them. The Duke himself spoke little, but his presence beside her was a wall of deliberate protection, and twice, when conversation veered toward intrusive questions, he deflected with such cutting precision that the inquirer retreated in confusion. Victoria's face across the table was a study in barely controlled fury, her smile frozen and her eyes glittering with something dangerous. When the evening finally ended and Lydia returned home in the carriage, Victoria, maintaining an icy silence the entire journey, she'd convinced herself the entire encounter had been some fever dream of humiliation. The Duke had been kind in the moment, perhaps, or simply making a point. Men of his stature didn't make proposals to women like her. They certainly didn't mean them. She climbed the stairs to her room, exhausted and confused, and tried to sleep. The pounding on the door came at dawn. Lydia woke to shouting downstairs, her stepmother's voice shrill with shock, and the unmistakable thunder of official business being conducted. She'd barely pulled on her dressing gown when Victoria burst into her room without knocking, her face pale with rage. "What did you do?" she hissed. "What did you possibly do to make him?" "Miss Cromwell," a man's voice from the doorway, calm and formal. "I'm Mr. Blackwood, solicitor to His Grace the Duke of Haven. I've come to escort you to Haven Estate. Your belongings will be sent for." Lydia stared. "I don't understand." Mr. Blackwood produced a document from his leather case, the heavy paper stamped with the royal seal. "His Grace invoked the Royal Registry Act at 3 o'clock this morning. You are named as his intended bride, Miss Cromwell. The registration is complete and legally binding. No formal engagement period is required under the Act, and the bans have been waived by special license. The wedding will take place within the fortnight." The words made no sense. Lydia looked at Victoria, whose expression had transformed from rage to something closer to shock, then back to the solicitor. "But I didn't agree. The Act requires only the declaration of intent from the peer, Miss Cromwell. It's an old law, rarely invoked, but entirely legal." Mr. Blackwood's expression was professionally neutral. "His Grace felt it necessary to protect your position and reputation after last evening's incident. I have a carriage waiting." An hour later, Lydia found herself standing in the entrance hall of Haven Estate, a vast stone edifice that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Her single trunk, all she'd been allowed to bring, sat beside her. Servants moved with quiet efficiency in the shadows, and everything smelled of beeswax and old money and controlled power. She was a piece on a chessboard, she realized, moved into position by a master player for reasons she couldn't fathom, and she had no idea what game was being played. The Duke requested her presence in his study at 10 o'clock. Lydia arrived precisely on time, her armor firmly in place, the same severe charcoal dress, hair pulled back with punishing efficiency, and found him standing by the window, backlit, so his face remained in shadow. "Miss Cromwell," he said, turning, "please sit." She sat, spine rigid, hands folded, waiting for the explanation that would reveal his true motives. Charity, pity, some elaborate revenge against Victoria's family she couldn't yet perceive. "I imagine you have questions," he said, taking the chair across from her. "Not behind the imposing desk," she noted, but facing her as an equal might. "Several, Your Grace." "Gideon," he corrected. "We'll be married in 12 days. Formality seems unnecessary." He leaned back, studying her with that same unsettling intensity from the dinner. "I'll be direct. I need a wife. The title requires an heir, and I've delayed the matter long enough. You need protection from a household that treats you abominably. This arrangement serves us both." The bluntness was almost refreshing. "You could have any woman in London. I could have any woman willing to overlook this." He gestured to his scarred face with clinical detachment, which generally means women interested in the title rather than the man. "I prefer honesty to pretense." "And you think I'm honest?" I think you understand what it means to be judged on appearance rather than substance. His eyes held hers. I watched you last night. You didn't flinch when your stepsister attacked you. You didn't weep or make a scene. You absorbed it with more dignity than most people possess in their entire lives. That's not weakness, Miss Cromwell. That's strength. Something in her chest tightened dangerously. She forced her voice to remain steady. So, this is a business arrangement. A partnership, he corrected. I won't pretend affection I don't feel, and I don't expect it from you. But I will treat you with respect, protect your position, and expect your intelligence in return. I'm told you read extensively. Yes. Good. I have need of someone who can hold a coherent conversation about something other than gossip and fashion. He stood, moving to the shelves that lined the wall. This is my library. You're welcome to it. In fact, I'd appreciate your company here in the evenings. I'm working through several political treatises and find I think more clearly when I can discuss them. Over the following days, a strange rhythm developed. Lydia would spend her mornings with the estate manager's wife learning the household, and her evenings in the library with Gideon. They would sit in opposite chairs, books in hand, and fall into discussions that ranged from philosophy to military strategy to the economics of agricultural reform. He never touched her, never offered false warmth, but he listened when she spoke, challenged her ideas with genuine interest, and twice revised his own position when her arguments proved stronger. It should have been enough. It was more than she'd ever expected. But Lydia found herself watching him for the tells she knew must come, the moment his eyes would slide away from her face in distaste, the carefully controlled expression when he had to look at her directly. She waited for pity to surface, for regret. She held herself tighter, spoke more carefully, and tried not to hope for anything beyond respect. Because hope, she'd learned, was just another way to break. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered with the regular post. Lydia recognized Victoria's hand immediately, the elaborate script designed to look elegant but always slightly too ornate, trying too hard. She should have burned it unopened. Instead, she broke the seal. Dearest Lydia, I hope you're settling into your new circumstances comfortably. How strange it must be to find yourself in such a grand house when only weeks ago you were occupying the smallest room in ours. I confess the entire situation has left me quite confused. People are talking, of course. They wonder why a duke would choose someone so unsuited, unless he had particular reasons for avoiding scrutiny himself. A scarred man taking a plain wife, it does create a certain symmetry, doesn't it? Two damaged things, seeking shelter from the judgment they'd each face alone. I only write this out of sisterly concern. I'd hate for you to believe his choice was based on anything more than mutual convenience. Men like the Duke don't marry women like you for admiration, Lydia. They marry them because no one will look too closely at either party. You're his shield, dear sister, just as he is yours. I do hope you won't mistake practicality for affection. That would be terribly painful for you. With love, Victoria. The paper trembled in Lydia's hands. She read it twice, each word finding the soft places in her armor she'd thought she'd sealed shut. A shield, mutual damage. The phrasing was Victoria's particular poison, just plausible enough to lodge in the mind like a splinter. Miss Cromwell? She looked up to find Gideon in the doorway of the morning room, still in his riding clothes. She hadn't heard him approach. Lydia, he corrected, moving into the room. His eyes went immediately to the letter. What is that? Nothing, just correspondence. She moved to fold it, but her hands weren't cooperating properly. He crossed the space between them and took the letter from her fingers, not roughly, but with absolute certainty. She watched his eyes scan the page, watched his expression transform from neutral to something carved from ice. This, he said quietly, is what passes for sisterly affection. She's not wrong, though, is she? The words escaped before Lydia could stop them. Two damaged things. It's logical. Gideon's gaze snapped to her face with such intensity, she nearly stepped back. You believe this? I believe in practicality, Your Grace. You said yourself this was a partnership of mutual benefit. I said, he interrupted, his voice hard as stone, that this was a partnership built on respect, not damage, not hiding. He moved closer, the letter crushed in his fist. Your stepsister is a vicious creature who cannot bear to see you beyond her reach. This is jealousy, dressed as concern, or it's truth dressed as cruelty. Something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or recognition. I chose you because you possess more genuine worth than every vapid, decorative woman in that ballroom combined. Because you have the strength to endure what would break lesser people. His voice dropped. If I wanted a shield, Miss Cromwell, I'd have chosen someone far less remarkable. You draw attention rather than deflect it. I draw mockery. You draw my respect. The words were clipped. Absolute. And anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me. He turned and threw the letter into the fireplace, where it caught and burned to ash. Lydia watched the flames consume Victoria's words, but she could still feel them, embedded deep. You're his shield. And the terrible part was, she didn't know if Gideon's fierce defense was proof Victoria was wrong, or proof she was exactly right. Lord Atherton arrived 3 days before the wedding, unannounced and uninvited, his carriage bearing the Atherton crest that marked him as Gideon's cousin and one of the most influential voices in the House of Lords. Lydia was in the library when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall. Raised voices, sharp and angry, though she couldn't make out the words. She moved to the door just as it slammed open. Gideon stood in the hallway, his face carved from granite, and behind him Lord Atherton, a tall man with silver hair and an expression of aristocratic disdain. This is not a discussion we'll be having in front of. Gideon stopped when he saw Lydia. Something shifted in his expression, shuttering closed. Miss Cromwell, please excuse us. It wasn't a request. Lydia retreated into the library, but the door didn't close completely, and voices carried. Have you lost your senses entirely? Atherton's voice was cold with fury. The Royal Registry Act? For a nobody, with no family, no connections, no... Careful, Gideon said. The word quiet and lethal. I'll be blunt, since you seem to have forgotten your position. The party needs your support for the reform bill. Half the lords are watching to see which way you'll lean, and instead of securing a strategic alliance through marriage, you've made yourself a laughingstock. A duke marrying some plain merchant's daughter out of what? Pity? Impulse? My marriage is not your concern. Your marriage affects every political alliance you've built. Lord Pemberton has already withdrawn his support. The Duchess of Westmore is reconsidering her backing. They view this as evidence of instability. Gideon, poor judgment. A pause. Choose a proper bride, or you'll find yourself isolated when the vote comes. Silence. Then Gideon's voice, colder than Lydia had ever heard it. Get out of my house. You have 4 days to reconsider. Out. The door slammed. Footsteps retreated. Then nothing. Lydia waited, expecting Gideon to return to the library, to explain or reassure or continue the conversation they'd been having before the interruption. Instead, she heard his study door close with decisive finality. He didn't emerge for dinner, or the evening after. For 2 days, Gideon became a ghost in his own house, issuing orders to servants, conducting meetings behind closed doors, moving through the halls with military precision, but speaking to no one, least of all her. When Lydia tried to approach him in his study, he looked up from papers covered in dense script and said simply, "Not now. I'm handling it." Handling it, alone. Without explanation or consultation. She watched him from a distance, saw him receive a succession of stern-faced men, heard fragments of conversation about political backing and strategic considerations and acceptable alternatives, saw the way he transformed into something remote and calculating, every interaction measured for advantage. The man who discussed philosophy with her in the library had vanished, replaced by the Duke of Haven, in all his cold, ruthless efficiency. And Lydia understood with sudden, painful clarity what Victoria had meant. You're his shield. But shields were discarded when they became liabilities. She stood in the empty library that night, surrounded by books they'd discussed and debates they'd shared, and wondered if she'd been foolish enough to mistake a political calculation for genuine regard. Gideon was protecting his position, and if that meant protecting her, it was only because losing her now would be embarrassing. Not because she mattered. Because the optics mattered. The wedding was in 2 days, but for the first time, Lydia wasn't certain it would happen at all. Lydia packed in the small hours of the morning, moving with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. 1 trunk. The few dresses she'd brought from her stepmother's house. The books Gideon had given her. No, she couldn't take those. They weren't hers. Nothing here was hers. She'd written no note. What could she possibly say? Thank you for the brief illusion of respect before reality intervened. She was fastening the trunk when the door opened. Gideon stood in the doorway, still dressed from whatever late meeting he'd been conducting, his cravat loosened and his hair disheveled. His eyes went to the trunk, then to her face. "What are you doing?" Lydia straightened, lifting her chin. "Leaving, before I become more of an embarrassment than I already am." "You're not an embarrassment." "No?" She heard her voice rise and couldn't stop it. "Then why have you spent 2 days avoiding me? Why have I heard nothing but whispers about political damage and acceptable alternatives?" "I'm not a fool, Your Grace. I understand when I've become a liability." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "You're not a liability. Atherton is a pompous ass who is right." The words came out sharp, final. "This marriage is damaging your position. You need a proper alliance, not a—" She gestured to herself. "Not whatever this is. I release you from the arrangement. I'll go quietly. We can say I was unsuitable, that I—" "Stop!" The word cracked like a whip. Gideon crossed the space between them, his control visibly fracturing. "You think I care what Atherton says? What any of them say? I think you care about power, about control. And I think I'm a convenient piece in a game I don't understand." She met his eyes, forcing herself to speak the truth Victoria had planted. "I'm your shield, aren't I? A plain bride for a scarred duke. Too damaged." "Don't." His voice broke on the word. "Don't say that word." "Damaged? Why not? It's true. Ugly." He was breathing hard now, something wild and desperate in his expression. "You were going to say ugly, like your vicious stepsister said. Like Catherine said when she looked at my face and couldn't hide her revulsion quickly enough." Lydia froze. "Who's Catherine? The woman I was going to marry before this?" He gestured to his scar, his hand shaking. "Before the riding accident that wasn't an accident. Before I woke up with half my face destroyed, and she took one look and fled. She didn't even have the courage to say it directly. Just a letter. I cannot bear to be seen with someone so afflicted." The raw pain in his voice made Lydia's chest ache. "I learned my lesson," Gideon continued, his words coming faster now. "Never be vulnerable. Never let anyone close enough to use your flaws against you. Find a suitable wife who'd overlook the scar for the title and never expect anything real." "Then why?" "Because you weren't overlooking anything." The words exploded from him. "When you looked at me that night, you didn't flinch. Didn't pretend the scar wasn't there or offer false sympathy. You just saw me. And when your stepsister called you ugly, you stood there with more dignity and strength than anyone I've ever known." His voice dropped, rough with emotion. "You're not damaged, Lydia. You're extraordinary. And I chose you because for the first time in 5 years, I saw someone strong enough to see past surfaces, someone who might see me the same way." Lydia stared at him, her carefully constructed walls crumbling. "You chose me because you're beautiful," he said simply, not in spite of what Victoria said, but because everything she tried to diminish is what makes you remarkable. The silence that followed stretched between them, fragile and trembling with possibility. Lydia could feel years of careful armor pressing against her ribs, urging her to retreat, to protect herself before the inevitable pain came. But Gideon's eyes, dark and unguarded and terrified, held hers with an honesty she'd never seen in another human being. "I spent so long being what Victoria named me," Lydia said quietly, "that I forgot I could be anything else. I made myself severe because it was safer than hoping someone might see past it. Easier to be deliberately ugly than accidentally insufficient. You were never ugly. Neither were you." She moved closer, slowly, giving him time to retreat. He didn't. "You were betrayed by someone cruel and shallow. That's her failure, not yours." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I've spent 2 days trying to handle Atherton and the others without involving you because I thought—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I thought if I kept you separate from the ugliness of politics, you wouldn't see how much damage I'm willing to cause to keep you. How utterly. I've abandoned strategy for something I can't control. And what's that?" "Hope," the word came out broken. "That maybe you'd choose to stay, not because of the title or the protection, but because—" Lydia reached up and touched his scarred cheek, feeling him flinch and then hold absolutely still under her palm. "Because I see you," she finished softly. The brilliant, infuriating, carefully controlled man who burns his political bridges for a woman society calls plain, who treats her like an equal when the entire world says she's beneath him. You're not beneath anyone, neither are you. She smiled, and it felt strange on her face, genuine and unguarded. So stop hiding from me. No more locked doors, no more handling things alone. Together? He asked, and the vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her. Together. When Lord Atherton returned the next morning, he found them united in Gideon's study, Lydia seated beside the Duke's desk, not behind it, reviewing correspondence together. The shock on Atherton's face, when Gideon introduced her as my partner in all matters, political and otherwise, was deeply satisfying. The wedding proceeds as planned, Gideon said, his tone allowing no argument. And if you or anyone else questions my choice, you'll find yourself on the wrong side of every vote I influence for the foreseeable future. Are we clear? Atherton left without another word. The wedding took place 2 days later in Haven's private chapel. No grand society affair, just the vicar, 2 witnesses, and a couple who had finally learned to remove their armor. That night, in the library that had become their shared sanctuary, Lydia sat beside her husband, not across from him, and felt his hand find hers in the space between their chairs. "Thank you," Gideon said quietly, "for seeing me." Lydia turned to face him, this scarred, remarkable man who'd chosen her when the world said he shouldn't. "Thank you for seeing me first." Outside, society would continue its gossip. Victoria would nurse her resentment. Political allies would question and judge. But here, in the honest space they'd built between them, 2 people who'd been called ugly had found something far more valuable than beauty. They'd found truth, and in that truth, they'd found each other. Not damaged things seeking shelter, but whole souls finally seen. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. We hope this story reminded you that being seen for who you truly are is the most romantic thing of all. If this story touched your soul, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with your loved ones. Your support motivates us to keep telling more stories full of love, redemption, and emotional twists. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.